I'm going to try to go through some of that now. Think about this global conversation. It'll be a brief one, but this global conversation and how it impacts the home front as well. I'm going to have a set of terms here to kind of guide this conversation. I'll try to pull those up. Not many, but a few. So we can only understand, I think, Vietnam and some of these other conflicts in terms of the Cold War backdrop that we've been, discussing. They don't make sense really outside of that. But what happens with the end of that era? What does the world look like afterwards, right? How is it a tipping point in many ways? In the 1970s and 1980s, you see these kind of dramatic reversals in international relations, right? The world is changing. The U.S. and the Soviet Union are constantly jockeying for position. But they also, I think, realize at some level that when both sides have nuclear weapons, right, mutually assured destruction, as they call it, MAD, changes everything, right? You're not fighting conventional wars anymore. Even if you quote unquote win, nuclear annihilation is something where nobody really wins. So I think in some ways it changes the relationships, and at least some on both sides will start to try to figure out how to thaw the Cold War, as they say, or to let it not be so tense. We have too many moments where it seemed like we could go to World War III, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis. We're extremely close in a moment like that to having World War III, and I think some realize we got to back up a bit away from the cliff that both of us seem to be ready to fall off of. In international politics, you start to see not just two superpowers battling, but the rest of the world kind of rising in certain ways. It's almost a multipolarity, right? Instead of two poles, you have like multipolarity, right? You have the USA, of course. You have the Soviet Union as the two remaining superpowers. But you also have some others that are going to have a say and have a voice and start to regain certain positions. This word détente, right? Détente is a French word. It's used to describe this kind of relaxation of tensions, right? A relaxation of tensions. It's not a complete relaxation. We're still going to see Cold War politics determining things around the world. It's not a coincidence that the Soviet Union goes into Afghanistan in 1979, right? And then we go into Afghanistan, right, a couple of decades later, right? Some of the stuff is not coincidental, and it only makes sense in this kind of broader Cold War mindset, where fighting these battles abroad has a direct impact on the home front, on national security, on the good of your nation, essentially. But we're going to see also how things start to change and how some of the leadership will make certain moves to try to win the Cold War and then figure out what the world is going to look like after. Within a few years, this détente will start to sour, especially by the early 80s. Ronald Reagan will be elected president, and he's really elected kind of with the mandate to win the Cold War, a mandate to return America to its prominent status. In a way, many argue that we kind of have a national depression almost through the 70s, especially by the late 70s, realizing that we're not as powerful as we thought. Again, we've kind of lost in Vietnam. Things like the hostage crisis, right? Oil crisis. Look at the news today, and you can see how cutting off of oil can have a major impact socially, right? You have similar events happen in the 70s, and so Reagan kind of gets elected with this mandate of he's going to make us great, right? It's almost psychological in many ways. He's extremely popular and powerful in that sense. So most of his first term, he's going to come off as strongly anti-communist, and in many ways he's going to raise the stakes, right? This is really the strategy. He wants to raise the stakes with the Soviets to a place where they cannot match. Right? Some argue that that's how we're going to win the Cold Wars, by outproducing, outspending, building up more weapons in a way that the Soviet Union is not going to be able to match and ultimately will collapse. And that's really what happens. Right? The USSR will ultimately collapse. Christmas 1991, it collapses and breaks up into 15 separate and independent republics. So the idea is you're going to outspend them. You're not going to outbomb them, right? Because that isn't going to work. And they have bombs too. But you can outspend them, cause them to shift so much of their economy to defense spending that their people are starving. And that's essentially what is going to happen. So between George Bush and Ronald Reagan, you kind of have some similar policies. George H.W. Bush, the older Bush, was elected in 1988, and he would proclaim that America's willingness to wage a Cold War had led to a, quote, new world order under U.S. leadership. Right? So he's thinking about how is the world going to look after we win. Even though it hadn't happened yet in 1988, it seemed like it was going that direction. So this is part of what you want to see. What does the world look like in the 80s and early 90s and up to the turn of the century? What we see is that there is a post-Cold War world developing. Can't say that very well. Post-Cold War world developing. But what's it going to look like? Is it going to be dominated by the U.S.? Is it going to be a kind of multipolar power, or there's going to be a Soviet Union that's powerful and Europe that's powerful? What about Asia? Right, the reemergence of Japan, China, as we know, will emerge. The U.S. Right, is it multipolar now, and is that more complicated? Is that better than what we had seen in the previous 4 decades? We're going to start to see more public interactions in our backyard, as we called it, especially Latin America, Central America. Again, some would argue that the Cold War continues to impact that. So, for example, President Bush's first assertion of power in this kind of new world would occur in Central America, and not in Russia, but in Central America. December 1989, he will send U.S. troops to seize the dictator of Panama, General Manuel Noriega. General Manuel Noriega had been a long-time U.S. ally, but he's going to be accused of kind of complicity in the drug trade, drug trafficking. So he had been an ally militarily, but they have a falling out, you could say. And the notion is that he is complicit in the drug trade. So what are we going to do about it? It's another country, right? Do you have sovereignty, to use Anderson's language? Well, we'll figure that out, right? This is the kind of stuff that it's not the first time it happens, so we have perhaps some new foreign policy at play. U.S. helicopter gunships would attack and flatten Noriega's headquarters in the Panamanian capital. We're going to blow it up, basically. And as many as 4,000 civilians may have been killed, but the idea is that, some will die in the process of removing a greater threat, right? Again, keep the logic in mind as we think about a number of activities in this period. Noriega is eventually captured and sentenced in a Miami court, and in a few months, kind of Panama would vanish from U.S. newspapers in the same way that Grenada had done under Reagan after the invasion in 1983. So some saw kind of similar activities, right, in this part of the world. Noriega's kind of disappeared. He gets sentenced to jail, and we don't really hear anything else from him. President Bush's next action against the dictator will be against the Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein. This will take American troops further and in far greater numbers, right, further from home, takes them to the Persian Gulf, right, the Persian Gulf War, which resulted from Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait in August of 1990. So again, this has taken us through the 80s into the 90s, but it's seen as another kind of military excursion with perhaps political and economic motivations or significance, however you want to see that. Saddam Hussein was probably surprised at our reaction, right? He probably didn't expect the U.S. to send troops and invade, halfway around the world, around this small land of Kuwait, but that's exactly what would happen. Both Reagan and Bush had given Saddam Hussein substantial help in his war against his longtime enemy, Iran. So in many ways, again, this is another former U.S. ally that finds himself on the wrong end of the U.S. and probably was surprised by that, right? They're no longer going to be friendly. Even after their war ended in 1988, Iraq had received some $2 billion in U.S. aid. So again, Saddam Hussein probably felt pretty comfortable when he's doing what he's doing that we weren't going to get involved or there wouldn't be any problems with us. So we had been given $2 billion, even though some in the U.S. Knew that some of those funds were being diverted to other uses, right? That aid wasn't all going where it was supposed to. Partially, it might have been going to his ambitious arms program, right? So I remember a lot of friends in the military that talked about, if they send weapons, if they send missiles back at our troops, a lot of them might say made in the USA. It was a society that, going to war against a place that we had helped develop seemed complicated, to say the least. But he also was using things like poison gas, right? Perhaps wanting to develop nuclear weapons. This is, becomes problematic to many in the administration. Again, even though the American public didn't know much about this, early on, it's really not as easy to kind of set up Saddam Hussein as the same type of threat as, say, an Adolf Hitler. Right? It is interesting because I remember in the news at the time you did see those comparisons made, but they don't really hold up in many respects. You could kind of set it up as a good versus evil, right? A battle versus good versus evil, but maybe the Hitler thing might have been a little bit too much. Hussein was a notorious dictator, right? Ruthless, cruel. But if we looked at Iraq as the bad guy, it's also difficult to make Kuwait the kind of picture of democracy that was invaded, because Kuwait wasn't a democracy either. 19 families, including that of the ruler in Kuwait, controlled 90% of the $100 billion in oil revenue in Kuwait. And Kuwait had invested in Western banks. So it wasn't about necessarily defending a democracy, but it may have been about, from the beginning for many, protecting economic interests and investments. And often that can be an even more powerful motivator, as we've seen. So again, setting up the kind of good versus evil worked on some levels, but on other levels it may not have worked. Some in the administration actually thought Saddam Hussein had some genuine grievances against Kuwait. The border between Kuwait and Iraq had been imprecisely drawn. Right? Think about borders being drawn and maps being redrawn. The border between them had been imprecisely drawn on a map by the British colonial administrator in the 1920s. So literally kind of, the modernizing of that region, a lot of it occurred by outsiders, including Britain, who had a stake in the oil in the region even before we did. So some say, you know what, he kind of has a point, but can't let him invade, can't let him take over in this way. From Saddam Hussein's perspective, Kuwait was also damaging the region and the OPEC oil-producing and exporting countries. Right? OPEC is a conglomerate of oil-producing and exporting countries, mostly in the Mideast, but not all. Like Venezuela is a powerful oil producer, as well as Nigeria is a powerful oil producer. But often they come together to set prices and improve their position. So Kuwait was kind of going outside of that, and from Iraq's perspective, was kind of dumping oil on the market in order to get favor from the West. And again, when they're attacked, the West does come to their aid. So some saw, a relationship there. Since Iraq also depended on oil sales, Saddam Hussein calculated that every $1 off of the OPEC price cost his country $1 billion. So from his perspective, it might have been economic as well as political in terms of his decision to attack Kuwait. But again, the world will decide, and the U.S. will decide that that's not good. That's not going to work, right? President Bush would decide that Saddam must be punished, as Noriega had been before him. It's almost like a blueprint in place there. For the first time since the Korean War, the U.S. is able to mobilize the United Nations Security Council against an aggressor. So we think about the UN as kind of a child of the League of Nations that Woodrow Wilson had proposed, that the U.S. had never joined. But we will be able to influence the UN here and actually take action against Saddam Hussein. It'll be mostly U.S. troops, but it will be a UN sort of action against an aggressor. The weakened USSR, right, the weakened Soviet Union, could only kind of go along with the decision to send a multinational army. So in some ways this is significant because remember, The U.S. and Soviet Union had been at each other, but now, I don't know, it's almost a shift. Russia is not, the Soviet Union is not really so keen about it, but they're not going to stop it. They're not going to stop it. So I think you're seeing something important in that decision as well. But the military force will be mostly composed of young Americans that get sent to the Persian Gulf. Their mission is essentially to reinforce economic sanctions that have been voted against Saddam. So they're going to, continue or extend or heighten kind of the punishment. Against his critics, President Bush would argue a number of points, right? Those that criticized his policies, he argued a number of points. One of them is going to be the lessons of the 1930s, right? The lessons of the 1930s. So he would use history and the history of how the era leading to World War II should be a kind of blueprint, a game plan for the 1990s. Right? So what are the lessons of the 1930s? Well, the lessons are basically that aggression must be resisted everywhere. Right? Aggression must be resisted everywhere. There's kind of a couple of prongs to that. There's the notion of appeasement in the 1930s of Adolf Hitler. Right? You had Britain and others that seemed to keep letting Hitler, do things before World War II fully, begins. So he's going to start taking over Europe. He's going to make moves against Poland ultimately, which is going to be a kind of tipping point. But before that, Yugoslavia, right? And the notion was on the British side and the other side, okay, let him do little things and then he'll be satisfied. But others say you never are satisfied when you're not opposed, right? You don't give up these things. So it only emboldened him. So Bush would use that and say you cannot appease someone like Saddam Hussein. You need to take action early in order to make sure that it doesn't extend. I think we can also look at the Cold War as an impact on this thinking, right? Domino theories and quarantines, right? This notion that you fight communism everywhere, even if it's in a small, far-off nation, so that it doesn't come to your backyard, right? You don't wait for it to come to Los Angeles to have to fight communists in the streets, quote unquote, right? You go abroad in Vietnam and Korea, wherever it is, and fight it there. So I think a lot of those lessons are still being employed here in the 1990s, for better or for worse. We can decide whether that was a good playbook or whether it wasn't a good playbook. Same question is often asked about the war on terror. Is it similar to the Cold War? Should we use the same sort of strategies and tactics, or is it completely different? That's still a lesson that I think we're trying to figure out. So in terms of these lessons of the 30s, Saddam Hussein is compared to Hitler quite often in the news and other places. Again, the comparison might make sense kind of symbolically as, a bad guy and all of that, but in terms of his power, it's not a good parallel, right, in terms of the actual threat and power. Iraq had a population at the time of about 18 million people, right, which is less than half of Los Angeles right now. So it's not really the Third Reich in the way that Adolf Hitler's threat, was a very real one. So some would say that the comparison or the parallel breaks down. At other times, the administration spoke of the Persian Gulf's intent and the interventions there, I guess, to defend the American way of life, right? The tradition, national interest. These are all sorts of things you hear. Others say it was about oil, right? Cheap oil. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, right? You would argue that a nation is dependent on oil. It needs to protect those interests. And others might say that if it's just about economics, you shouldn't be there. If you set yourself up as a democracy, or these sorts of things. Again, similar stuff in the news today might impact our thinking on dependency, right? Dependency. These are important words. American and the U.S. has always considered itself to be independent, right? We fought for our independence, so on and so forth, politically. But what happens when a nation is dependent economically? Are you truly independent in that way? And I think this era is going to actually be a catalyst for a lot of changes in our thinking. Think about movements towards using more solar power or non-oil-based things, right? This is a tipping point in many ways. Because at the time, in 1990, the U.S. economy had become dependent on foreign oil sources. 50% of 50% of our oil in 1990 was taken from foreign sources. So if that's cut off, it could have a serious impact. Again, think about some of the lines you see, at gas stations and such. So what are we going to do? How are we going to change that? Unlike Japan, that had responded to oil price shocks in the 1770s with kind of planned reductions in consumption, their vision was you have to use less. The U.S. during the Reagan years had essentially abandoned conservation. We kind of went the other way and actually start using more. Again, perhaps that puts us in a dependent position when something like this happened, even though you could also argue that it kind of makes us powerful and great economically. So this, is all what led up to Saddam Hussein and the reaction to him on the side of the U.S. When Saddam ignored the UN deadline to evacuate Kuwait, Bush ordered the long-planned attack. For 6 weeks, the U.S. and Allied forces pounded the Iraqi army in Kuwait and facilities in Iraq, mostly via air. When they launched a ground attack in February 24th, 1991, the war is going to be over within about 100 hours. So once troops actually went in, it's over pretty quickly. The U.S. does quite well with our military strength, despite the fact that the Iraqi army was, I think, the third or the fourth largest at the time. The Iraqi army is essentially sort of wiped out from the air as it stampeded home from Kuwait, suffering casualties perhaps 1,000 times greater than the Allies. U.S. combat casualties totaled 146 in this first conflict. After such a lopsided victory, many Americans expected that Allied armies would overthrow Saddam Hussein, but Bush decided against it in this first excursion. The ceasefire agreement required Iraq to complete its withdrawal from Kuwait and to surrender its chemical and nuclear weapons, but not to change its government. It did not require kind of a reconstruction or a shifting government. Some political advisors suggested to the Bush administration that if Saddam were overthrown, Iraq itself might collapse, altering a very delicate balance in the Mideast, right? A delicate Mideast balance of power. So some thought it might be worse to remove him, that other factions would take over, other nations might shift into more powerful positions, and so they decided initially not to remove him in 91. And as we know, that decision will be revisited later. The returning American soldiers will receive a hero's welcome, and many in government believed that the success had finally kind of overthrown what they called the Vietnam syndrome, like this kind of long-seeming depression, national depression seemed to be over because we now have another successful kind of victory here. But is that going to be true? And think about that in connection with later the battles, long ongoing battles with a war on terror and such. Some even suggested that the victory in the Persian Gulf signaled the beginning of a post-Cold War New World Order, as Bush had said, to be imposed by the U.S. So we, in the minds of some, were the one remaining superpower, and so we will determine what the world looks like. Other critics said that perhaps these are hollow victories, that they weren't as substantial as we thought, and that more dangers might be on the horizon. Right? They're not as optimistic. Some say the supremacy over the USSR and Iraq are not what they would have been perhaps a decade earlier. Others said the Cold War is over, and it wasn't won by the U.S., it wasn't won by the Soviet Union, perhaps it was won by Japan. This notion of Japan rebuilding itself after the atomic bombs, right, in a few decades with a lot of U.S. help. They're going to establish a massive economy and growth and technology and such. So some say that maybe it's a third party that benefit the most from this. Today we might make arguments about China, right, if we're thinking about Asia overall and Asian economic power. So think about this notion of the Cold War. Who won, who lost? This is still a sort of a debate, and most agree that the U.S. won by spending, but we're also going to do things like increase the deficit several times over. So does that constitute a true victory, or is it a partial victory? These things are still debated. Right? They're still sort of debated. So again, maybe Japan won, according to some critics. Although the U.S. Did supply most of the troops for Operation Desert Storm against Hussein, it could really only muster about 10% of the cost, right? 10% of the $61 billion cost. The rest of the money had to be asked. Some say we had to beg U.S. allies like Germany and Japan to help pay the bill. Although they didn't offer troops, right? They were even more dependent in some ways on foreign oil than we were. So perhaps there's a unity in that. Buried by debt that had tripled in the 1980s during the Cold War, that had tripled in that decade, the U.S. had become a less effective economic competitor. So some say we won the war politically, but maybe not economically, if we think about it in those terms. Militarily, the U.S. is the only superpower left, but economically, the U.S. found itself challenged in the new century by a united Europe. And think about the formation ultimately of the European Union and resurgence of Europe's economy, by Japan, and today, we put China definitely in that category as an economic competitor that the U.S. has some concerns about. All right, so I know that's a lot, especially in terms of the global aspects, but I want you to think about how the 70s connect to the 80s and 90s, and afterwards, of course, we get to September 11th in 2001, and how some say that changes everything again, right? A new tipping point, beginning of a war on terror and such. Some say that we can use the lessons of the Cold War to fight a war on terror. Others say that they don't apply, and that maybe it's misguided to try to use those same lessons. Right? So it's still a difficult question. American foreign policy is often shifting in this way to try to figure out what the best thing is. So think about this notion of this era from the 70s to the 90s, how it connects to what we previously discussed in the 60s and before.